The first time I noticed the white SUV tearing across my land, I thought it must have been a mistake. I had been in the barn that morning, fixing a broken hinge on the cattle gate, when I heard the roar of an engine. It wasn't the steady hum of a tractor or the familiar sound of my old pickup. It was faster, louder, reckless. I stepped outside and shaded my eyes against the sun, and that's when I saw it. A shiny white vehicle racing across my wheat field like it was nothing more than an open packing lot. The stalks bent and broke under its tires as it cut through the rows I had worked so hard to plant. My first reaction wasn't anger, it was disbelief. Who would be foolish enough to drive across someone else's farm in broad daylight? I stood frozen as the car sped across the dirt path and onto the paved road beyond. It disappeared into the horizon, leaving behind a trail of crushed wheat and dust. My heart sank as I walked toward the damage. I bent down and touched the broken stalks, feeling the sting of wasted work. Every seed I had planted carried meaning. Every row represented long hours under the sun, and to see it flattened in a matter of seconds felt like watching a part of my father's legacy get trampled. But I told myself maybe it was just an accident, maybe they got lost or panicked and thought this was a road. I wanted to believe people weren't so careless. The next day, just after lunch, I was repairing a section of fencing on the east side when I heard the same sound again. That engine, loud, cocky, and thoughtless. My stomach twisted before I even saw it. And sure enough, the same white SUV came barreling across my field, leaving a new set of tracks across the soil. This time I got a good look at the driver. Two women sat up front, both with sunglasses, both laughing as if this was the funniest thing in the world. Their laughter carried across the open air, high-pitched and mocking, as though my land were their playground. They didn't slow down, didn't hesitate, didn't even glance my way as they disappeared down the same route. That's when I realized it wasn't an accident, it was a choice. The following morning I drove into town for supplies. While at the general store, I overheard some chatter near the counter. Two women stood there, voices sharp and entitled, bragging about how they had found a perfect shortcut through some old farmer's land. I felt my chest tightened. I didn't need to see their faces to know who they were. When I turned, sure enough, it was the same pair, the Karen sisters, as most folks in town called them. They were known for their attitude, their constant complaining, and the way they seemed to think the world owed them everything. Their brother worked at the sheriff's department, which made them feel untouchable. I approached them carefully, choosing my words with more patience than I felt. "Ma'am," I said, nodding politely, "that land you've been driving through, it belongs to me. I'd appreciate it if you stayed off. You're ruining my crops." They looked at me as if I had just told the best joke of the year. One of them tilted her sunglasses down her nose and smirked. "It's just a field," she said with a shrug. "Grow more." The other laughed outright, tossing her hair back. "You should be grateful we're even driving through. Makes your land look less boring." The people in the store had gone quiet, listening. I could feel the heat rising in my face, but I kept my voice steady. "I'm not asking for much. Just respect my property. Please don't drive through my fields again." They didn't answer, at least not with words. They turned their backs to me, still chuckling, and carried on with their shopping as though I wasn't there. I stood for a moment, humiliated, aware of every eye in the room. Then I left, gripping the steering wheel of my truck so tightly on the drive home that my knuckles turned white. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the laughter, the dismissive way they brushed me aside. The farm had been my father's pride. He had worked it every day until his hands were cracked and his back bent, and now it was mine to protect. Every blade of grass, every furrowed row, carried history, and yet, to them, it was just an empty shortcut. They weren't only breaking crops, they were breaking respect. The days that followed made things worse. It seemed that my warning only encouraged them. They started driving through at random times, sometimes in the early morning, sometimes late in the evening. Once, when I was out herding cattle, they honked at me and waved, laughing as they passed like they were daring me to stop them. I put up signs, bright red ones with private property and no trespassing written in bold letters, but the sisters treated them as decorations. The more effort I put in to stop them, the more determined they seemed to prove they could do whatever they wanted. Neighbors gave me advice, though none of it helped. Some told me to call the sheriff, but I knew how that would end. Their brother's influence meant the complaint would be brushed aside, maybe even laughed at. Others told me to just let it go, that it wasn't worth the fight. But how could I let it go? Every tire mark cut into my land felt like a scar in my father's memory, and each laugh, each honk, each careless wave fueled a fire inside me I didn't know I had. I wasn't looking for trouble. I wasn't a man who enjoyed conflict. I wanted peace, a quiet life tending to the farm, honoring the work passed down to me. But peace doesn't last when someone keeps poking and prodding, testing how much you can endure. The sisters had crossed a line, not just once, but again and again. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. They weren't going to stop unless someone made them. By the end of that week, I wasn't asking myself whether I should act, I was asking myself how. For days after that humiliating encounter in the general store, the Karen sisters seemed to make it their mission to test my patience. Each morning when I walked the fields, I could see fresh tire tracks cutting through the soil like scars, evidence of their latest trespass. Sometimes they came in the afternoon, other times in the evening, always unannounced and always loud. Their white SUV became a symbol of mockery, a rolling insult that sliced through the heart of my father's land. Every time I saw it, a knot tightened in my chest, and every time I heard their laughter echoing across the wide open air, I swore to myself that something had to change. At first I tried to be rational. I thought if I made it inconvenient for them, maybe they would give up. I started by stacking hay bales near the areas they used most often. It wasn't much, but I figured at least it might block their path or slow them down. But within a day, the bales had been shoved aside, crushed by their tires like toys. Next, I strung rope across a section of the field, attaching it to wooden posts with bright red flags tied along the line to make it obvious. I hoped the message would finally sink in. Instead, the sisters cut the rope clean through and kept driving as if they had won some twisted game. Each time they tore down what I built, it was as though they were saying, "You don't matter. Your land doesn't matter. Only we matter." It was then that I realized something I had been trying to deny. These weren't just careless women taking a shortcut. This was deliberate. This was a challenge. They enjoyed it. They liked knowing they could drive across my land and I couldn't stop them. Their power came from my restraint, and they laughed because they knew they could get away with it. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. What right did they have to treat me, or anyone, that way? My father's voice echoed in my memory, calm and steady, reminding me of the lessons he'd taught me as a boy. A man's land is his life. Protect it, and you protect yourself. The breaking point came one Saturday evening. I was leading the cattle back toward the barn when I heard the familiar growl of their SUV. The sound alone was enough to make my pulse quicken, but what followed made my blood boil. The sisters swerved dangerously close to my cattle, honking and laughing as the frightened animals scattered. One of the calves stumbled, nearly breaking a leg in its panic. I rushed forward, waving my arms, shouting for them to stop, but they didn't. Instead, they slowed just enough to roll down the window. One sister leaned out, her sunglasses glinting in the setting sun. "You can't stop us, farmer boy," she yelled, her voice dripping with mockery. Then they sped off, the SUV kicking up dirt in their wake. I stood in the field, my hands trembling with rage. My cattle were panting and restless, their eyes wide with fear. I knew then that this wasn't only about my land anymore. It was about respect, about safety. If they could endanger my animals without a second thought, what would stop them from going further? And if I let them keep doing it, what kind of man would I be? That night, I sat on the porch with a lantern beside me, staring out across the fields. The air was still, the crickets chirping softly, but inside me there was a storm. I went over every option in my head. Call the sheriff. Pointless. Their brother would laugh in my face. Put up stronger fences. They'd break them. Confront them directly again. I already knew how that would end: more laughter, more humiliation. No, I realized the only way forward was to teach them a lesson they couldn't ignore. Not by hurting them, I wasn't that kind of man, but by hitting them where it mattered most. Their car was their pride, their symbol of superiority. Shiny, spotless, always polished like it was the centerpiece of their lives. If I could take that from them, even just for a moment, maybe they'd finally understand that actions have consequences. The idea settled in my mind slowly, like a seed taking root. I remembered the old trench my father had once dug years ago when he needed to redirect water during a flood season. The memory gave me inspiration. If I created something similar, hidden just beneath the surface where they always drove, it would catch their vehicle by surprise. Not enough to hurt them, but enough to ruin their precious car. Enough to make them think twice before ever setting tire on my land again. For days I planned quietly. I watched their patterns, noting the exact stretch of field they favored. They weren't unpredictable. They always followed the same path, the same shortcut. I measured the distance carefully, marking it in my mind, and began gathering what I needed. Steel rods, wooden planks, loose soil, hay to disguise it all. Each evening after my chores, I worked in secret, sweating under the fading light of the sun as I dug into the earth. My hands blistered, my muscles ached, but every strike of the shovel carried purpose. I could almost hear my father's voice guiding me. Stand firm. Protect what's yours. There were moments when I doubted myself, when I wondered if I was going too far. What if they got hurt? What if it backfired on me? But then I remembered the calf stumbling in fear, the wheat crushed, the mocking laughter in the general store. They hadn't cared about me, my land, or anyone else. They had been warned again and again. They had chosen this path. All I was doing was giving them what they asked for: a consequence. The night I finished, I stood back and looked at my work. The trench was covered perfectly, disguised so well that even I had to remind myself it was there. To the eye, it was nothing more than another patch of field. But beneath the surface lay a trap strong enough to cripple their car. I wiped the sweat from my forehead and leaned on my shovel, feeling both exhausted and strangely calm. For the First time in weeks I felt like I had taken back control. When I returned to the house, I slept better than I had in months. The plan was in place. Now all I had to do was wait. The morning after I finished the trench, I walked my fields with a strange sense of anticipation. The sun rose over the horizon, painting the land gold, and for the first time in weeks, I wasn't staring at tire marks or broken crops. I wasn't tense, waiting for the roar of an engine. Instead, I felt calm, steady like a soldier who had finally fortified his walls. I didn't know when the sisters would come again, but I knew they would. They were creatures of habit, drunk on arrogance, and when they did, the land would answer them. I went about my day as usual, feeding the cattle, fixing a leaky roof panel in the barn, and pulling weeds from the vegetable patch. But beneath every task was a quiet current of expectation. My ears stayed tuned for the sound I hated most, that high, throaty growl of their SUV. I half wondered if maybe they would skip a day, if luck might delay the inevitable. But deep down, I knew better. They always came. Sure enough, just after noon, I heard it. A low rumble at first, then louder, faster, the sound tearing through the still air. My chest tightened, but this time it wasn't anger, it was something sharper, colder, like a hunter hearing prey approach. I set down the HOI I was using and walked toward the edge of the field. Every step deliberate, my boots sinking into the earth. The white SUV appeared in the distance, sunlight glinting off its polished hood. The sisters were inside, windows down, music blasting, their laughter carrying far enough to reach me even before they were close. They took the same route as always, wheels cutting across the soil, ignoring the no trespassing sign I had hammered in just the day before. The SUV bounced slightly over the uneven ground, but they didn't slow. I could almost predict each swerve, each honk, each mocking wave. My jaw tightened as I watched them head straight for the stretch of land I had prepared. Time seemed to slow in those next moments. The SUV thundered forward, confident and careless, its tires spinning over the earth I had carefully disguised. Then, in a flash, the front wheels dropped. The heavy vehicle lurched forward, slamming nose first into the trench. A sharp, metallic screech split the air, followed by the crunch of bending steel. Dust exploded around them as the SUV ground to a violent halt, its back wheels still spinning in the air like a trapped beast. For a moment, there was silence. No music, no laughter, just the ticking of the engine and the settling of dirt. Then, the sisters' voices broke through, high-pitched with shock and outrage. "What the hell?" One of them screamed, her voice carrying across the field. The others' curses followed, a string of anger and disbelief. I stood at the fence line, arms crossed, watching calmly as they scrambled out of the car. Their shiny white SUV was no longer spotless. The hood was crumpled, the front bumper torn, half off, one headlight shattered. The left tire hung useless, bent at an ugly angle. The mighty machine they had used to taunt me lay broken, defeated, and half buried in the dirt it had once crushed so freely. The sisters staggered toward me, their designer sunglasses askew, their perfect hair now coated with dust. Their outrage was written all over their faces, twisted with fury that their toy had been ruined. "You did this," one of them shrieked, pointing a manicured finger at me. "You sabotaged us." I didn't move. My voice came out calm, steadier than I expected. "I warned you, over and over. I warned you. This is private land. You had no right to be here." The other sister stomped forward, her hands on her hips. "You'll pay for this. My brother's a sheriff. You're finished. You hear me, finished." I met her glare without flinching. "No," I said firmly. "I'm done being your road. I'm done being your joke. You brought this on yourselves." They sputtered, furious, circling their wrecked car like it was a dead pet. They kicked at the dirt, tugged at the bumper, cursed loudly at me, at the land, at everything except themselves. And I stood there, letting their anger wash over me like meaningless noise. For weeks they had laughed at my expense, mocked my warnings, treated my father's land like garbage. Now, for the first time, they were the ones feeling powerless. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, one of them pulled out her phone. She dialed quickly, her voice dripping with rage as she explained the attack to whoever was on the other end. I didn't need to guess it would be their brother, the deputy. I expected retaliation, maybe even false charges, but I refused to let fear show. This was my land, my right, and I had done nothing but defend it. When she hung up, she turned back to me with a smug smile, though the anger still burned in her eyes. "You're going to regret this. He'll be here any minute. We'll see how tough you act then." I didn't answer. I just turned and walked back toward my barn, my boots steady against the earth inside. My hands trembled slightly, the adrenaline finally catching up with me. I had done it. The plan had worked. Their car was wrecked, their pride shattered. But I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. If their brother came, I would have to face him too. Still, as I glanced out the barn window and saw the sisters pacing around their broken SUV, I couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction. For the first time since this all began, the land was quiet. No engines tearing it apart, no laughter mocking my work. Just silence, thick and heavy, as though the farm itself approved of what had been done. That night, as the stars blinked awake, In the sky, I sat on my porch again. The sisters' SUV had been hauled away by a tow truck, leaving behind a mangled patch of dirt that would heal with time. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the crickets, breathing in the peace that had returned, if only for a while. I knew there would be consequences. Their brother would come. The sisters would scream louder, push harder, demand revenge. But I also knew something else, whatever storm was coming. I was ready. Because today, for the first time, they had learned fear. And once someone learns fear, they can never unlearn respect. I didn't have to wait long for their brother to show up. The next morning, before I'd even finished feeding the cattle, I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. This time it wasn't the roaring arrogance of the sisters' SUV, it was the steady heavy roll of a county sheriff's department truck. My chest tightened as I wiped my hands on my jeans and stepped out of the barn. Sure enough, the man behind the wheel was Deputy Mark Collins, their older brother. He climbed out slowly, his hand resting on his belt, his badge catching the sunlight. He was a broad man with a permanent scowl, the kind of face that always looked like it was searching for a fight. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You've made quite a mess of things, haven't you?" I kept my tone level. "Morning, Deputy. If you're here about your sister's car, I suggest you talk to them first. They've been trespassing on my land for weeks. I've told them to stop more times than I can count." He smirked, shaking his head. "They said you set a trap, dug a hole, covered it up, nearly got them killed. That true?" "I didn't set a trap for them," I said evenly. "I reinforced my property. Anyone who respects the signs wouldn't have driven there, but your sisters think rules don't apply to them." He stepped closer, his boots grinding into the dirt. "That's my family you're talking about. You think you can lay hands on their property and not face consequences?" I held my ground. "Deputy, with all due respect, this is about more than family. This is about the law. Trespassing is trespassing no matter whose name you wear. My land isn't a public road. Your sisters ignored every warning I gave." For a moment, silence hung between us, the air thick with tension. His eyes narrowed, and I could see the conflict playing out in his head. He wanted to side with his sisters, to throw his badge around and make me pay. But I also knew that even family ties had limits. If he pushed too hard, the whole town would know he was abusing his power. And while people feared the Karen sisters, they also whispered about how much trouble they caused. Finally, he exhaled sharply and looked away, muttering under his breath, "You're lucky they weren't hurt." "They're lucky they weren't hurt," I replied. "They could have been trampled when they spooked my cattle last week. I've been patient, Deputy, but enough is enough. If they come back, there'll be no car left for you to tow." His head snapped back toward me, his eyes blazing. "Is that a threat?" "It's a promise of boundaries," I said calmly. "And boundaries are what keep peace around here." He stared at me for a long while before finally backing down, though his glare never softened. "This isn't over," he muttered, climbing back into his truck. The engine rumbled to life, and as he pulled out, I stood rooted to the spot, my fists clenched at my sides. When he was gone, I let out the breath I'd been holding. I knew I'd just walked a tightrope. One wrong word and I could have been hauled into town in handcuffs. But deep down, I sensed that even he understood. His sisters had pushed too far, too many times. If he punished me, he'd be making excuses. For them, abandoned, even a sheriff's deputy can only cover for family so long before it stains his own reputation. Still, I didn't fool myself into thinking the problem was solved. The sisters weren't the type to accept humiliation quietly. If anything, the wrecked SUV had only fueled their bitterness. They'd be back, one way or another, and I had to be ready. That evening, I drove into town for supplies. As I walked into the general store, I felt every eye turn toward me. The story of the sisters' wreck had spread like wildfire. Whispers followed me down each aisle, some filled with sympathy, others with curiosity, and a few with thinly veiled amusement. Folks had been watching this feud play out for weeks, and now it seemed the tide was turning. Old Mr. Harlan, who ran the feed store next door, gave me a nod as I passed. "Heard you gave those girls a taste of their own medicine," he said, with a faint grin. "About time someone did." I offered him a small smile but said nothing. I wasn't looking for praise, I was just trying to live in peace. But the truth was, part of me felt vindicated. For so long, the sisters had walked around town like queens, untouchable and smug. Now, at least, people saw they could bleed like anyone else. On my way out, though, I caught sight of the sisters themselves. They were parked on a bench outside the store, their faces twisted with fury as they watched me walk by. Their once pristine clothes were wrinkled, their hair still not quite recovered from the dust and dirt of the wreck. "You think you've won," one of them hissed as I passed, "but you've just started a war." I stopped, turning to face them squarely. "I didn't start this," I said quietly, "but I'll finish it if I have to." They glared at me with venom in their eyes, but I didn't linger. I climbed into my truck and drove away, leaving their anger behind like a storm cloud on the horizon. Back at the farm, I doubled my efforts to secure the land. I reinforced the fences, added new locks to the gates, and kept the dogs closer at night. My instincts told me the sisters weren't done. Humiliation, especially public humiliation, had a way of breeding vengeance, and if their brother couldn't punish me with the law, they would try to punish me in other ways. Days passed with an uneasy quiet. The field stayed untouched, no tire marks scarring the soil. The cattle grazed peacefully. The air was calm, but beneath it all was a tension I couldn't shake. I woke each morning expecting to find broken windows, poisoned feed, or worse. I carried my rifle more often, not because I wanted to use it, but because the sight of it might remind anyone watching that I wasn't defenseless. One night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat on the porch with a lantern beside me, the same way I had so many nights before. The crickets chirped, the dogs lay at my feet, and for a moment I let myself believe maybe the sisters had learned their lesson. But then, in the distance, I saw headlights flicker against the trees. My stomach tightened. The lights didn't move like a car passing on the road. They lingered, waiting, watching. I stayed perfectly still, my hand resting on the rifle beside me. The headlights flickered again, then disappeared into the darkness. Whoever it was, they weren't gone for good. That was the moment I knew the storm hadn't passed, it was only gathering. The night the headlights vanished into the trees, I barely slept. Every creak of the house sounded louder. Every rustle of the wind felt like footsteps creeping across my porch. The Karen sisters weren't done, not by a long shot, and I knew I had to be ready. They had lost their car, their pride, and their composure, but people like them didn't let things go. They came back harder, sharper, more desperate, and now that their brother couldn't use his badge to scare me into submission, they would have to try something else. For the next few days, I carried myself like a man under siege. I checked the locks twice, sometimes 3 times, before bed. I made sure the dogs were fed and alert, their ears sharp to every sound. I walked the fields each morning, scanning for signs of sabotage, but the land stayed quiet. Too quiet. It was as if the sisters were gathering their anger in silence, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came on a Friday night. The air was heavy with humidity, the sky split now and then by distant lightning. I sat on the porch with my lantern burning low when I heard voices, not laughter this time, but hushed, angry whispers. My pulse quickened as I set the lantern down and grabbed my rifle. I stood slowly, peering into the darkness. Shapes moved along the fence line, 2 figures creeping toward the barn. The sisters. Even in the faint moonlight, I recognized their outlines. One carried something long and metallic, maybe a crowbar. The other dragged a canister that clinked with each step. My stomach sank when I realized what it was. Gasoline. They weren't here to drive across my land. They were here to burn it. Rage flared hot in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. I couldn't rush in blindly. I needed them to see I wasn't afraid, that I wouldn't bow to their malice. I stepped down from the porch, the crunch of my boots on gravel snapping their heads toward me enough. My voice rang out across the still night. "Drop it, both of you." They froze, caught in the act, their faces pale but defiant. One of them lifted the crowbar, her voice shaking with fury. "You ruined everything. You humiliated us. We'll make sure you never farm another day in your life." I raised the rifle, not aiming to shoot, but to remind them where they stood. "You try to light that barn, and you'll be the ones answering to the sheriff. Not me." They hesitated, their bravado flickering like a weak flame. For once their arrogance wavered, but then the sister with the gasoline sneered, tipping the can slightly so the fumes filled the air. "You won't do it. You're too scared to fight back." I took a slow step forward, my voice low and steady. "Scared? No. I'm just tired of your games. Tired of your disrespect. Tired of watching you trample over everything decent. You've pushed and pushed, but here's where it ends." For a tense moment, none of us moved. The storm clouds rumbled overhead, lightning flashing across their faces. Then, with a frustrated cry, the one with the crowbar dropped it, the metal clattering against the ground. The other sister glared, clutching the gasoline, but her resolve broke under my stare. She let it fall with a dull thud, and the silence that followed was heavier than any scream. "Get off my land," I said firmly, "and don't come back." They stood there trembling with fury, but something in my tone, or maybe the rifle in my hands, finally reached them. They turned and stormed off, their angry mutters fading into the night. I watched until their figures disappeared into the dark, then lowered my rifle, my hands shaking with the rush of adrenaline. The next morning I called the sheriff's office. The deputy, but the sheriff himself. I told him everything, from the trespassing to the attempted arson. I expected doubt, maybe even dismissal, but to my surprise, he listened carefully. It seemed the sisters' reputation had caught up with them, and I wasn't the only one tired of their antics. By sundown, word spread that they had been brought in for questioning. The gasoline canister and crowbar were enough evidence to make their brother's protection useless. For the first time, they were facing real consequences. The days that followed brought a peace I hadn't felt in months. No engines tearing across the fields, no laughter mocking me from the distance, no headlights lurking by the trees. The farm healed slowly, the soil softening where the trench had been, the crops pushing upward toward the sun. The cattle grazed without fear, and I worked without the weight of constant vigilance pressing down on me. One evening, as I leaned against the porch railing watching the sunset, I thought about my father. I imagined him standing beside me, his weathered hands folded across his chest, a small smile tugging at his lips. He would have been proud not of the trap, not of the conflict, but of the fact that I stood my ground, that I didn't let arrogance and cruelty destroy what he had built. The Karen sisters had lost their shortcut, their car, and their untouchable image. I had lost my peace for a while, but I had gained something stronger in return: respect. Not just from the town, but from myself. I had faced down people who thought they were bigger than the law, and I had shown them that even the smallest piece of land, when defended with conviction, could stand against them as the last light of day faded. I whispered to the fields, "This is ours, Dad, and no one's taking it from us again."